right. Can I get a thumbs up if you guys can hear me? Yep, awesome. So thank you three for being here today. I see it's 10:40, so just due to time, we'll just get right into things. So first, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm here on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. My name is Alyssa Bohart. For people who are unfamiliar, I'd like to say welcome to all of the people who are joining us in this discussion session. I hope everybody had a chance to watch all three videos. I thought they were a really great range of different types of ecosystems and different types of potential issues that climate change might bring to these different types of systems within North America. And yes, I'll just do a bit of ground rules for the session today. So just letting people know that all of the sessions are being recorded. So all of these sessions that you might not, that are happening right now that you may not be attending, those will be available for 3 months on the platform following the event. So no need to feel like you're missing out on any talks. Please submit any questions that you have using the Q&A feature on Whova, or you can also just directly do it in the chat on the Zoom window here. And you can change your view between gallery or speaker at the top right-hand corner if you choose to do so. And then, yeah, I think that's everything since we're doing things a little bit differently off of the Whova platform since now. Okay. So I'll just start by giving a brief bio of all of the speakers, and then we'll kind of jump into things. So a bit of background on Cesar. So Cesar completed his undergrad in Brazil, fostering his passion for wildlife and carrying it to now, where he is working on his PhD in ecology at the University of Alberta, investigating climate change resilience of bird communities and the boreal ecosystem. He is also the chair of the International Committee within the Wildlife Society's Student Development Working Group, and the co-chair for the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee of the Society of Canadian Ornithologists. And then next we have Larissa. So Larissa completed her Bachelor of Arts at Vancouver Island University, and her undergraduate thesis involved investigating the impact of climate change on the habitat range of the endangered Vancouver Island marmot. Currently, Larissa is a second-year master's student in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta, working under the supervision of polar bear biologist Dr. Andrew Durocher, hoping to further pursue a career in ecology with a focus on endangered species conservation. And then next we have Lionel. So Lionel completed his bachelor degree at Simon Fraser University, his master's at Ohio State University, and his PhD at the University of Manitoba. Currently, Lionel is studying land use and climate change effects on boreal forest bird communities at the University of Alberta. And he has also a range of different types of ornithological experiences while traveling abroad and doing different internships. So we have three really fantastic speakers today. So I guess we'll just jump into things. So I thought maybe we'd start with the questions that were in the Q&A on Whova. So starting with the first question for Cesar. So the comment was, great presentation. The iconography on your slides is really awesome. Is it possible to predict possible conflict or increased competition between bird species for these microclimate refugia?
Thanks for the question. Well, first of all, I think it's possible. It's just it's a very hard task. I would expect to see an increase in competition in species over time. That's for sure. But I think that the challenge, I think it's possible. There are some techniques currently that you can explore interaction between species, between multiple species. If it's just a pair of species, that's pretty easy. But I would assume because of advances in climate change and some habitats changing, and there's some transitions that are gonna happen. Some of these habitats are gonna remain for some longer periods, and within those tiny spots, maybe yes, you're gonna see an increase in competition. Yeah. I don't know if I answered the question, but
Yeah, no, I think
I
that was
might
good.
be able to add to that, although I haven't worked with any models that explore interspecies competition. One way could be to see which species are competing for the same habitat and then see how that habitat is changing over time, possibly through the use of land use scenarios. And then if you find that one species is more competitive in a particular habitat, and if that habitat is decreasing over time, then you might be able to predict that the more competitive species will probably win out in the competition for habitat. The other way that I can think of but haven't explored is you could try constructing some sort of multi-species occurrence model that sees if the presence of one species varies with the presence of another species. And then if that model contains spatially explicit habitat predictors for the presence of both species, then you might be able to predict not only the change in habitat types for both species, but you might be able to make predictions about the whatever it is that you're measuring as your metric of competition. But I haven't explored using land use scenarios with a multi-species occurrence model before. So I'm just speculating right now.
yeah, I've seen such types of models in the past, and I think they've been employed in a few papers that I read recently. So there are multi-species models that consider just the occurrence of these multiple species, but it's also possible to incorporate the interactions of the species. So different species can affect both the occupancy and the detection of species, and it gets really complicated. I haven't done that, but I know it's possible.
Yeah, that seems like it would get pretty complex pretty quick, but yeah, it would be quite useful to have something that can answer so many questions at once and tease apart kind of all those different interactions that are happening within a system. So kind of, I guess, going off of that for Caesar, I have a question for you. So I was just wondering what you had kind of mentioned at the end of your presentation that you were planning on looking at different types of species that might be sensitive to these climate changes. And so I was wondering if you have kind of like you can give us an idea of those types of species that you are going to be looking at. And then also, I guess, kind of touching on what Lionel was kind of talking about, do you anticipate maybe some of those species might be better suited or they might actually benefit from climate change within your ecosystem?
Yeah, there's a list. I don't remember the name of the author, Longhun, I guess. He's from United States. So they used breeding bird surveys routes. So it's just like a roadside sampling that is done all over North America, actually. And they basically modeled the occurrence or abundance of species as a function of a whole bunch of things, including climate. And they just projected their future distributions, and based on how much these species would lose in terms of habitat, or how much their distribution would shrink, they were saying, oh, this species is sensitive, this species is not so sensitive, and so forth. So my idea was in the future is to use, so they classified a whole bunch of species, of bird species. So my idea is to use that same classification to analyze how these birds might respond to climate conditions at a finer scale, because they did in a very, very broad, like continental thing. What was the other part of your question?
I guess I was just wondering if you anticipate any of the species within that you'll be looking at, if you think that any of them might actually benefit from climate change.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I guess a lot of species will benefit. If you think about some of the ecoregions in Alberta are expanding north. For example, grasslands are expected to increase. So any species that are associated with these expanding habitats will probably benefit. I would also expect some species that are more generalists to also benefit from this, and species that are more sensitive to climate, I would expect them to have to be more prone for negative, like they will lose a little bit in terms of distribution for sure. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you. So I think switching gears, we'll talk about, I guess, the kind of polar bear kind of world. So this question's for you, Larissa. That was in the chat. Someone was wondering, are there any preliminary patterns you've seen in seal distribution that you think will turn up interesting results when you incorporate seal habitat selection into the polar bear habitat selection analysis?
Oof. I've just started looking at my seal data, so it's kind of hard to say. They're definitely overlapping quite a bit within the Davis Strait region. It's just teasing apart what time of the year that I haven't really looked at yet. Yeah, sorry, I haven't looked too much at my seal data, so I can't say too much about that right now.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, that's the thing with preliminary analysis, right? It's either you've gotten to it yet or you haven't. And so sometimes it takes a long time to get to those kind of questions. So I guess I should clarify, I guess, for people watching, I was in the same lab as Larissa, so I have a polar bear background. So some of these questions that I came up with might be a little bit more specific to the system just because I'm more familiar. But I'll try and kind of phrase them so everybody can kind of understand, I guess, what's going on. But don't be shy about asking clarification questions if anything is a little bit confusing or you don't have the background knowledge. So I guess one of the questions I had, Larissa, with your presentation, so I'm more familiar with the Western Hudson Bay population where they typically have a bit of open water all year round as that polynya that kind of follows along the coast of Hudson Bay. So I was just wondering, does Davis Strait, like what is the ice regime there? Is there open water that does happen all year round for those bears as well? Or do we kind of see like a more complete freeze of all of the water in that ecosystem?
Yeah, no, in the southern portion, there's a lot of ocean currents that keep it ice-free all year round, pretty much. But the bears are seemingly staying kind of farther away from that area. And that's the last covariate actually that I'm trying to work on, but my code is giving me headaches right now, is trying to figure out how close they're actually staying to that open water or how far away they're from it. But yeah, there is a portion that's always open water.
Cool. So I guess, yeah, like the implications of that are, I guess with climate change, you're predicting that there'll be more open water for bears. Based on, I'm not sure if you're able to answer this question, but maybe based on background reading that you may have done on harp seals, do you have kind of an inkling of what type of habitat they might be selecting for?
Yeah, I know it depends on kind of what time of year and what they're doing, but they need pretty high concentration ice during their pupping period. So that springtime is when we'd expect to see them most overlapping with those bears in that area. But then not as high concentration, I think, the rest of the year while they're feeding. So yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. So I guess building off of that, so I guess what are kind of the scenarios that you think may happen So I guess I'm kind of assuming that your results will probably show that there'll be high overlap with the bears and the seals for habitat selection. And then I guess with climate change, you might expect that overlap to kind of change. So I'm just wondering if you can maybe talk about what we can maybe expect if that overlap starts kind of drifting apart, or what does potential climate change mean for polar bears and seals in this ecosystem?
Yeah. We're not just looking at like the potential for the ice to decrease over time and just like less available habitat over time, but I'm also interested more in like the timing, because the spring period is likely when we're going to see that overlap, and that's also when we're seeing breakup happening earlier and earlier. So I'm curious to see if the timing of the overlap is shifting as well. And with a lot of different species, when you talk about like plants or whatever, and the shifting of the phenological phases, that happening in the ice environment will be really interesting to see if it's shifting any other patterns that we're seeing with the seals. So are they, I don't know, pupping earlier, and is that matching up with polar bears, that kind of thing? So I'm really interested in seeing if I can, even with the data that I have, if I can see those trends. But unfortunately, I have just a small snapshot of data from like the 90s. So I don't have anything current to compare it to, but.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks for that, Larissa. So Caesar just asked a question in the chat. So he says, not super related to Larissa's talk, but are there expectations that polar bears might eventually disappear due to interbreeding with grizzlies moving north?
Oh, I haven't heard like the disappearance just based on the grizzly perspective, but definitely disappearance based off of them not being able to find food and losing their habitat. So that grizzly angle is really interesting, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, I guess from what I've heard on the grizzly bear front, I think it's not as frequent, I think, as the media kind of portrays it to be. And so I don't think there's any studies that have actually like modeled for what is the potential of kind of grizzly bears kind of taking over polar bears. But at least from, I guess, like what I've heard, that it's not the biggest risk to polar bears, I guess, essentially, with climate change kind of being the biggest impact, and the impact on ice and seals. And so Lionel asked a question as well. So he says, would polar bears see increased competition from orcas for seal prey in the Arctic as the Arctic Ocean becomes less icy?
Yeah, that's actually where some research is coming out right now, is looking at the increase of killer whales out there. So I don't know much about that, but that's definitely a potential.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that, Larissa. So I have a question here for Lionel. So this question is, why link species distribution models to kind of land use simulator, to one kind of land use simulator over another?
Okay, so if you saw my talk, you would have seen that I had worked with output from 3 different simulators at one point or another. So I described species distribution models for a bird called a Canada warbler in my talk, which is a species at risk in Canada. So this is a species that, at least in Western Canada, is associated with very old deciduous forests, which are potentially attractive habitat for timber harvesters. So one set of simulations was used a simulator that is currently quite popular with forestry companies for designing harvest plans. And you can create very specific patterns of land use with this particular simulator called Patchworks for extracting the most harvest for the least amount of costs associated with things like road construction or getting wood and pulp to the nearest mill, but you can also include social and environmental considerations when designing harvest plans with the simulator. So that is one reason why you might like that simulator. But the Patchworks simulator is particularly focused on harvest as a source of forest loss, even if this loss is temporary. There are other simulators that you might want to consider for other kinds of footprint in addition to harvest. They might not have, they might not allow you to create the same specific harvest plans that you can get with Patchworks. Although one of them, Landis, is pretty good. But these other simulators, they have their own advantages. They incorporate other kinds of models. For example, the Patchworks simulator, it does talk about tree growth, but the Landis simulator, it's particularly designed to look at tree species succession within forests, and can account for effects of climate, competition from other tree species, various natural disturbances, such as insect outbreaks, windstorms, or fires, affect tree growth, and hence the forest suitability for different forest species. You can also account for effects of climate change in land use scenarios developed in Landis. On the other hand, there's another simulator called ALSES Online, which is good for modeling various kinds of human disturbances besides harvest. You can also model different kinds of natural disturbances with ALSES Online as well. And you aren't necessarily limited to forests, which is the kind of environment that you would probably use Patchworks and Landis in. So what all of these simulators have in common is they take the existing landscape within a study region, and then they simulate changes to the landscape. And these changes can be probabilistic. So the probability of a given disturbance happening can depend on its proximity to other disturbances of the same type. For example, you're not going to simulate the development of new power plants and residences in a rural wildland that's far away from roads, unless you have some roads nearby to begin with. You're not going to be as likely to simulate fire in an area that has less flammable vegetation, like a wetland, in contrast to something like a coniferous forest. And ALSES Online also is, ALSES Online and also Landis, they you have some ability to simulate the way that disturbances spread in the landscape, which again affects the habitat in the future available for different species.
Very neat. Thanks, Lionel. Yeah, it's really neat to know that there's that many tools out there to model these types of things. And they seem like really fantastic tools that are, I guess, specific to the ecosystem, but there's no reason that those types of tools couldn't be made for other types of ecosystems to kind of inform management as well. So I guess building off of that, I have another question. And so I guess this applies to either Lionel or Caesar. So I guess when you're presenting, Lionel, about Canada warbler, so this is a migratory species. And so I was just wondering, would you anticipate to see similar results in their kind of winter territory of where their habitat is down there? Does that habitat kind of go through similar disturbance regimes? Or I guess, like, how do they compare to each other?
I think that the disturbances that are experienced by Canada warblers on their wintering habitat are potentially the source of those disturbances is potentially quite different. I'm not as experienced with how Canada warblers use use particular habitat in the winter. Some species that are that breed in older forests in North America, they may end up using quite different habitats in the winter or on their stopover grounds, or even after they fledge from nests and are moving about as juveniles before they migrate. But for Canada warbler, the main disturbances of their forest habitat in Canada would be due to harvest and probably due to energy sector developments here in northern Alberta. If they do use forests more than shrublands in their winter habitat, there would be some harvest and possibly some energy sector disturbances in northwestern South America, because I think that at least there would be some oil and gas and gold mining exploration in those regions. But I think that the main source of forest disturbance by humans would be due to agriculture and possibly due to increases in forest fires. Although I'm not sure if it's as big if it's increased as much of a disturbance in northwestern South America or Canada warbler winter as it is in other parts of the Amazon.
Probably not as much. Yeah. I would expect so, at least.
Yeah.
It's pretty humid and unpopulated for the most part, those regions.
Okay. So I guess, Cesar, a question for you as well, kind of on the tail of that. So some of the species I guess you're looking at are also migratory species. So do you think it's important to kind of look at, I guess, like a similar type of study that you've done in their wintering habitat as well?
Yeah, sure. But I think that whenever I think about species that migrate, I always think that these animals they go through all sorts of habitats and all sorts of climate regimes. And my expectation is always that they are very flexible or plastic in where they go and where they decide to settle in. So from a climatic perspective, and just for the fact, just because of the fact that they experience a variety of different climates and they kind of thrive, let's say. I think that climate per se might not necessarily be the biggest constraint for migratory species, but it's what the climate will, it's how the climate will affect their habitat mostly. So it's kind of like this indirect effect mostly. I think that plays a much bigger role than say, oh, it's a little warmer here and it's a little colder there. Now, in terms of climate changes in some of their wintering habitats, I'm not so familiar with how fast climate is changing in some of those areas. But I know that I think that some of the things that are going to happen with climate change are quite different from what we will see here in Canada. So I don't necessarily expect, for example, that fire frequency will increase in South America, for example. I'm not so sure. I don't know much about that literature. But if you think about the boreal, I mean, fire is one of the biggest natural things that promote changes in the landscape. Like the boreal is basically fire prone. And that will, if fires increase, that means that a lot of changes will happen in the near future, right? I don't know if they answered the question.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that provides like really good insights as to how, yeah, like migratory species might kind of be a different type of species to adapt to climate change, and they might be more capable of adapting to climate change since they are a more plastic species than, say, a specialist or something like that. So just to be cognizant of time, it is 11:10, which is the end of our session. So I want to thank you all for participating in the conference, participating in this great conversation that I think we've had today. We've discussed a range of topics, and I think, yeah, it's been very valuable to hear everybody's kind of expertise in their own different ecosystems.